Space seems empty and motionless only at first glance. In reality, it is constantly changing. Planets move, stars die, galaxies collide. But all of this obeys one rule: time always moves forward. It has always been this way. Until one day, that rule failed. On the outskirts of explored space there was an old, long-studied star. It had gone out ages ago and held no scientific interest. There were no planets around it, no life, no energy. Only cold and emptiness. And that was precisely why no one paid attention to the orbit around it. The first anomalies were noticed not by humans, but by automated systems. A routine observation satellite passed nearby and transmitted standard data, coordinates, velocity, time. Everything looked normal until operators noticed one detail: the timestamp didn't match. The message arrived before it had been sent. At first, it was dismissed as an error. Space is a hostile environment. Electronics fail there all the time. The system was rebooted, the data erased, the clocks checked. But a few hours later, the error happened again. This time, the discrepancy was larger. And most importantly, it occurred at exactly the same location. When the satellite passed a specific point near the orbit, time seemed to start behaving incorrectly. The data became confused. Records repeated themselves. Seconds vanished. Scientists decided to run a simple test. They sent a second satellite along the same trajectory. Then a third. Then a fourth. The result was identical. Each device, passing near that orbit, lost part of its recorded time. Sometimes fractions of a second. Sometimes entire seconds. And sometimes something even stranger occurred. One satellite transmitted footage showing a small crack forming on its hull. A few frames later, the crack disappeared, as if it had never existed. The recording was playing in reverse. It was impossible. But it was happening. Over time, the strange region came to be called simply the orbit. No name, no number. As if the scientists subconsciously didn't want to give it form, to make it part of reality. The orbit did not glow. It emitted no radiation. It did not distort space. It simply existed. And near it, time began to behave strangely. The most alarming incident occurred several weeks later. A deep space observation satellite transmitted a short message, only a few seconds of footage. It showed the spacecraft's hull tearing itself apart in an explosion. The transmission was received, logged, and analyzed. 6 hours later, that same satellite actually disappeared. Its debris was found exactly at the point where the explosion had been recorded. It turned out the satellite had first reported its own destruction, and only afterward was destroyed. After that, there were no doubts left. This was not an error, not a coincidence, and not a technical malfunction. It was a zone where the very flow of time was disrupted. The scientists did not propose complex theories. They did what they always do: they observed. The more data they collected, the clearer one simple rule became. Near the orbit, events occurred in reverse order. Not completely, not chaotically, but as if someone were slowly rewinding reality. The closer an object came to the orbit, the stronger the effect. The longer it stayed nearby, the more time it lost. And most importantly, the effect was irreversible. What was rewound did not return. Information about the discovery was quickly classified. Only a few research centers were granted access to the data. The orbit was removed from navigation charts. Satellites were forbidden to approach it without special authorization. Officially, because of the danger. Unofficially, because of fear. Because no one could answer a simple question. What would happen to a human if they entered a place where time moves backward? The orbit did not look threatening. It did not scare. It did not warn. It simply existed, like a flaw in the very fabric of the universe. And very soon, humanity would decide to approach it closer than ever before. After the discovery of the strange orbit, scientists hesitated for a long time before taking the next step. There were too many unknowns, and the first data looked far too frightening. But space does not tolerate pauses. If something exists, it will be studied. The decision they made was cautious and, at first glance, safe. No humans. No complex systems. Just a simple probe. It was assembled quickly. No experimental technologies, no expensive equipment. A standard hull, basic cameras, sensors for temperature, pressure, and time. Everything as simple as possible, so that in case of failure there would be no questions about what exactly went wrong. The probe was given a dry, unimaginative name, M3. Its task was elementary: enter the orbit, remain there for several minutes, and then exit. The launch went smoothly. The probe followed its calculated trajectory, transmitting a stable signal. No deviations, no anomalies, until it approached the orbit. The first change was almost unnoticeable. The probe's internal clock lagged behind by a fraction of a second. That could happen anywhere: cosmic radiation, overheating, signal interference. The operators noted the deviation but gave it no real importance. A few seconds later, the delay increased. The data began arriving late, and then something happened that no one expected. A portion of the telemetry repeated itself. The same fragment of data arrived twice, with identical parameters and timestamps. As if the probe were living through the same moment again. When M3 fully entered the orbit, the effect became obvious. The cameras recorded a micro crack on the outer hull, a result of old damage. A few seconds later, the crack began to disappear. The metal seemed to remember what it had been before. The sensors showed a sharp change in temperature, but neither an increase nor a decrease. The readings were returning to earlier values. Everything was happening slowly, but clearly. Time was moving backward. The operators on Earth were silent. No one commented aloud on what was happening. Everyone stared at the screens, realizing they were witnessing something that could not be explained in familiar terms. The probe remained in the orbit for exactly 3 minutes. When it was time to exit, the engines activated automatically. M3 began moving away from the strange zone, and almost immediately the readings started to stabilize. The clock moved forward again. The data stopped repeating. The cameras showed ordinary reality. The probe exited. It seemed the experiment was over. But the real shock came later. A few minutes after leaving the orbit, M3 transmitted an additional data packet. It was a video recording that was not listed in the mission program. It showed the probe entering the orbit. The same trajectory. The same readings. The same frames. The recording perfectly matched what had already been received earlier. There was only one difference: the timestamp. The video was marked as recorded before the probe's launch. This meant only one thing. The probe had transmitted data about events that had not yet happened for it. Or, even more frightening, events that had already happened, but had been erased. The scientists began comparing all the recordings frame by frame and found a strange detail. In one of the videos, the probe was in a slightly different position. The difference was minimal, but it was there. As if M3 were living through the same moment multiple times, each time a little differently. It looked as though the orbit was not simply rewinding time, but forcing an object to repeat the past. To confirm this, a second experiment was conducted. The probe was sent again. The same trajectory. The same time. The same parameters. But the result was different. Some of the data did not match. The cameras recorded new minor damage that had not existed during the first flight. Part of the recordings was missing. And most importantly, the probe spent less time in the orbit than it was supposed to. It was as if it had skipped part of its existence. It became clear: the orbit does not just alter time. It takes it away. Every object that enters loses part of its future. And the longer it stays there, the more it loses. Probes could survive this. Metal could endure it. But what about a human? In one of the final data packets, M3 transmitted a strange signal. It contained no images or numbers. It was a short pulse, repeating again and again. Analysis showed that the pulse matched the frequency of the signals the probe had transmitted at the very beginning of the mission, as if it were trying to communicate with the past. After that, the experiment was declared complete. The official conclusion was cautious. The orbit represents a potential threat to crewed missions. The unofficial conclusion was far more terrifying. If a probe can lose its future, a human can lose themselves. And yet, the decision was made. To understand the nature of the orbit, they had to send those who were capable of comprehending what was happening. They had to send humans. After the probe experiments, there were no doubts left. The orbit truly affected time, not instruments, not electronics, but the very sequence of events themselves. It was dangerous. But even more dangerous was leaving everything as it was. Space does not tolerate secrets. If humans do not go to them, they will eventually catch up anyway. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Scientists argued, the military demanded control, politicians feared the consequences. But everyone understood one thing: sooner or later someone would fly to that orbit. The only question was who and when. The decision was made quietly, without public announcements. A crewed mission. The spacecraft was designed to be as simple as possible. No experimental engines. No new technologies. Everything tested, reliable, familiar. The fewer unknowns, the higher the chance of returning. It was small, cramped, almost ascetic. Only what was absolutely necessary for a short flight and a rapid return. The ship was named Reverse. The name did not appear in any official registries. It existed only within the project. The crew selection was especially careful. They weren't looking for heroes or fanatics. They needed calm people, capable of maintaining clarity of thought in any situation. People without heavy pasts and without plans for a distant future. 5 people. The commander, an experienced pilot with dozens of missions behind him. He knew how to make decisions quickly, without unnecessary emotion. The co-pilot, quiet and attentive, more accustomed to observing than speaking. The engineer, a person who knew the ship better than his own apartment. The doctor, not only a medic, but also a psychologist, trained to recognize the earliest signs of panic and disorientation. And the communications specialist, the one who had to maintain the fragile thread between the ship and Earth. They were not told everything. Only what was necessary. You are flying to an orbit where time may behave unstably. Your task is to enter, record your sensations, and exit. No heroics. No improvisation. Preparation moved quickly. The crew underwent tests. They were placed in isolated chambers, their sleep cycles disrupted, lighting altered, situations created in which the perception of time broke down. Everything was done to understand how they would react. The results were acceptable. No one broke. No one lost control. At least, not yet. A few hours before launch, the crew was shown the latest data from the probes. No complex graphs or formulas. Just video recordings. Cracks disappearing on their own. Repeated frames. Signals from nowhere. The room was silent. No one asked unnecessary questions. The launch proceeded normally. The ship, Reverse, lifted off the platform and disappeared into the darkness of space. Communication was stable. All systems functioned normally. The flight was no different from hundreds of others. Until they approached the orbit. Several minutes before entry, the crew began noticing strange little things. One crew member was certain he had already heard this warning signal, despite the instruments showing it was sounding for the first time. Another instinctively reached for the control panel, knowing that an indicator would light up there in a second. And it did. These coincidences seemed insignificant. They could be blamed on fatigue or tension. But the feeling was strange. As if events were outrunning themselves. The commander reported readiness. The ship began its entry into the orbit. At that moment, communication distorted slightly. Voices sounded delayed, and sometimes ahead of time. A reply arrived before the question. The instruments recorded unstable data, but there were no critical deviations. And yet, each of them felt the same thing. The sensation that they had already been here. When Reverse fully entered the orbit, one of the screens flickered. For a fraction of a second, a message appeared, one that no one had entered. Orbit exit failed. The message vanished as quickly as it appeared. The system showed that no errors had been recorded. But the crew understood. It was a warning. Or a memory. Despite this, the mission continued. For now, everything was under control. But ahead of them awaited something no simulator could prepare them for. The first real signs that time here was not merely moving backward, but breaking reality as they knew it. The first minutes inside the orbit passed calmly. Too calmly. If it weren't for the strange instrument readings, one might have thought that nothing unusual was happening. The ship followed its assigned trajectory, the systems worked steadily, and communication with Earth remained intact. But the feeling that something was wrong did not fade. Everything looked as if reality had shifted slightly, and the crew had ended up not quite where they were supposed to be. The communications specialist was the first to notice it. He heard his name in the headset and turned his head to respond. But the phrase had already been spoken. His own voice, delivered with the exact intonation he had not yet used. A second later, he actually said the same words. They exchanged glances. Someone gave a nervous chuckle, trying to ease the tension, but it only grew. It wasn't an echo. And it wasn't a signal delay. It was anticipation. Within minutes, such moments became more frequent. An indicator lit up, and went dark before anyone touched it. A compartment door opened as if predicting the movement of a hand. Even footsteps on the metal floor sounded as though the ship knew where a person was going before they did. The doctor began recording changes. Everyone's pulse remained normal, but reaction times slowed, not physically, but mentally. People seemed to remember things that had not yet happened. One crew member cut his finger on the edge of a panel. Blood appeared immediately, but within a minute the wound began to close. 3 minutes later, there was no trace of the cut. It was impossible. The commander ordered the time spent in the orbit to be reduced, but the decision came with a delay. The systems showed that the command had already been issued and executed. The engines powered up, then immediately shut down. The ship did not move. The report stated that the exit attempt had failed. But no one remembered making it. The most disturbing change was in the behavior of one crew member. He withdrew, spoke less than usual. At times he would freeze, staring into emptiness, as if listening to something the others could not hear. When the doctor asked what was happening to him, he did not answer right away. He said he felt as though he was forgetting something. Not the past, the opposite. The future. He knew that in a few minutes the lights in the compartment would go out. And they did. He said that someone was about to drop a tool. The tool fell. Each such moment intensified the fear. Communication with Earth deteriorated further. Replies arrived before questions. Sometimes sentences cut off, as if erased. Operators on Earth claimed they were receiving data the crew had not yet transmitted. At one point, Earth received a distress signal from the ship, with the exact time of the accident specified. In the future, the crew began to understand the most important thing. The orbit was not simply rewinding events. It was revealing them in advance. But the more they learned about the future, the less they were able to change it. Every attempt to act ended with the realization that the action had already been taken. The fear grew not from danger, but from helplessness. When you know that something will happen, but cannot stop it, that breaks you more than any catastrophe. One of the astronauts suddenly said he had seen an empty compartment. Without himself. Without signs of struggle. As if he had never been there at all. Sometime later, the cameras confirmed it. They recorded an empty space. The footage ran in reverse, first emptiness, then the person appeared, moving backward, as if being pulled back into the past. The crew understood. The orbit had already taken someone. The commander made the decision. They had to leave the orbit immediately. Even if the system said the attempt had already failed. Even if time itself resisted. Because staying any longer meant losing not life, but existence itself. But the orbit was in no hurry to release those who had already become part of its reverse flow. After the first serious disruptions, the crew began to act more cautiously. Fewer conversations, fewer unnecessary movements. Everyone understood, here, any action might not be the first, but the last. It was then that one of the astronauts said for the first time that he had already died. He didn't shout or panic. He said it calmly, almost indifferently, as if recalling a distant dream. According to him, it happened quickly. Without pain. He simply stopped being part of what was happening. "I remember the end," he said. "But I don't remember how I got there." The doctor tried to explain it as stress, overload, a distortion of perception. But he himself understood. The explanation didn't work. A person cannot remember something that hasn't happened yet. But here, many things were happening earlier than they should. With each hour spent in the orbit, the astronaut became more and more detached. He said he felt like a shadow, as if his future had already ended, and the present was merely catching up with the past. He knew where he would be in a few minutes. He knew what another crew member would say. He knew that one of the cameras would soon stop working. And all of it happened. The crew began to avoid his gaze. Not because they were afraid of him, but because they were afraid of seeing their own end reflected in his eyes. One day, he said that he would soon disappear. Not die. Not be killed. Simply disappear. He said there would be no pain and no noise. Only the feeling of being crossed out of history. A few minutes later, contact with him was lost. The cameras showed him walking down a corridor. Then the footage began to play in reverse. His steps retraced themselves. The door closed on its own. And then the corridor was empty. As if he had never been there. The crew rushed to the compartment. No signs of a struggle. No damage. No body. Even his personal belongings began to disappear. First small items, then records, then his name in the crew lists. The computer indicated that the mission had originally consisted of 4 people. The 5th was being erased from reality. But the most terrifying part came later. The cameras turned on again. The corridor was empty. Then, in reverse order, a figure began to appear. First a shadow, then outlines, then a person walking backward. He returned. Alive. But changed. He did not remember what happened after he disappeared. He remembered only the end. Emptiness. Silence. The absence of time. He said that beyond the orbit, he no longer existed. His future had already been lived. Now he existed only here. Inside reverse time. The crew understood a terrible truth. The orbit does not kill people. It rewrites their path. Those who lose their future become stuck between moments. They can appear and disappear, but they cannot leave. They become part of the orbit. The commander made a difficult decision. If the ship could not leave with the full crew, it had to leave with at least part of it. Because staying meant becoming next. The astronaut who had already died understood this. He did not resist. He even smiled. He said his time had not ended here. It had ended earlier. And now it was simply catching up with him. When the ship began preparing for departure, he stayed behind in the compartment. And this time, the cameras did not show any reverse motion. He simply vanished. Forever. The ship, reverse, remained with 4 crew members. And with the understanding that every extra minute in the orbit could erase another one of them. After the disappearance of one of the crew members, silence settled over the ship. Not the kind of silence where no one speaks, but the kind in which you can hear your own thoughts. Everyone understood. The line had already been crossed. This was no longer research. It was a fight for what remained of reality. The commander ordered that everything be recorded. Not for reports, and not for science. But so that something, anything, would remain if they did not return. But the recordings began to behave strangely. Some files appeared without timestamps. Others vanished while being viewed. Parts of the logs already contained events that had not yet happened. The ship seemed to be writing its own history. The crew tried to piece all their observations together, not with formulas or theories, but with simple conclusions. The orbit does not send people into the past. It does not move them through time. It removes the future. Every minute inside the orbit takes away something that has not yet happened. At first, small things. Then, important moments. And in the end, the person themselves. Anyone whose future ends completely simply disappears. That explained everything. Why the probe could transmit data in advance. Why people knew what would happen next. Why one of the crew remembered his death. He was not predicting the future. He was remembering it. The most terrifying realization was that the orbit made no distinctions. It did not care whether you were good or bad, a scientist or a pilot. It did not choose its victims. It simply erased what had not yet occurred. The crew began to notice changes within themselves. Someone stopped remembering important events of their life, not past ones, but future ones. Plans, dreams, intentions faded from consciousness as if they had never existed. One astronaut realized he could no longer imagine tomorrow. The thought simply broke off. As if tomorrow no longer existed. Communication with Earth became almost useless. Operators received reports about the crew's condition that had not yet been sent. Sometimes the logs stated that the ship had already returned. Sometimes, that it had been destroyed. No version was final. The commander asked the most important question. Can we leave? The answer was unclear. If the future in which they exited the orbit had already been erased, then any attempt was pointless. But if the moment of exit still existed, it had to be found. They realized that ordinary actions would not work. Every command, every maneuver appeared in the records first, and only then happened in reality. Time did not follow them, it ran ahead. That was when the idea emerged. If the orbit takes the future, then they must do what had already happened. They began searching the logs for events that were recorded but not lived through. Maneuvers marked as completed, yet never experienced by the crew. One of those maneuvers was the exit from the orbit. According to the ship's data, it had already occurred. All that remained was to repeat it exactly, without changing a single parameter. It was terrifying, because any mistake meant losing yet another fragment of the future. And their reserve of time was limited. The crew felt the orbit slowly tightening around them. Not physically, but at the level of perception. Events began to blur. Causes and effects swapped places. One of the astronauts suddenly realized he could not remember the moment of launch from Earth. Not as a memory, but as a fact. He knew the launch had happened, but he could not picture it. That meant only one thing. A part of his life had already been erased. The commander gave the order to prepare for exit. Not because he was confident of success, but because there was no other choice. Either they would try to leave now, or the orbit would decide for them. The ship began preparing for the maneuver. And at that moment, one of the screens lit up again with a message the crew had already seen before. Exit successful. The message was timestamped with a time that had not yet arrived. It was a chance, or the final mockery of reverse time. Preparation for exiting the orbit was carried out in silence. No one discussed the details out loud, though everyone understood this maneuver would be decisive. Either the ship would leave the zone of reverse time, or the crew would permanently lose their future. The commander checked the data again and again. The maneuver parameters were already recorded in the system as completed. All that remained was to repeat them exactly, without the slightest deviation. No improvisation. No changes. They had to play by the orbit's rules. The countdown began without a command. The system started the timer on its own, as if the ship knew what was supposed to happen. The numbers moved in reverse. Not forward, backward. Every heartbeat matched the click of the timer. When the engines ignited, no one was surprised. It felt as though they were simply remembering a moment that had already occurred. The orbit's resistance was not felt as a physical force, but as pressure on the mind. Thoughts tangled. Causes and effects traded places. People began to forget why they were here and what they were doing. One of the astronauts suddenly said he wasn't sure he was alive at all. His pulse was normal, his breathing steady, yet he felt like someone who had already finished their journey. A few seconds later, his image on the camera flickered and vanished. The systems recorded no accident. Pressure was stable. The ship sustained no damage. There was simply one person less. In his place remained an emptiness filled by neither sound nor movement. The computer instantly updated the crew manifest. Now there were 3. The maneuver continued. The commander wanted to stop the process, but realized he was no longer in control. Everything was unfolding strictly according to a pre-recorded script. And that script did not include saving everyone. Communication with Earth was completely lost. Fragments of messages appeared on the screens, messages no one had sent. One claimed that the ship had long since returned and the mission was deemed a success. Another stated that Reverse was lost along with its crew. The truth depended on the moment in time from which you looked. The remaining crew members held on with their last strength. Each of them felt pieces of the future disappearing from within. Not metaphorically, literally. One of them realized he could no longer remember what yesterday had felt like. Not the events, the sensations. As if yesterday itself had been cancelled. The ship shuddered. The instruments showed a sharp spike in parameters, followed by a sudden drop. The orbit seemed to be trying to hold on to prey that was already slipping away. The commander shouted a command, but the words sounded before he opened his mouth. It was the final push. At that moment, one of the screens showed empty space. The stars were motionless. The orbit was no longer visible. The ship exited. At least, that was what the instruments claimed. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. They waited for reality to fracture again, for time to roll back and for everything to begin anew. But it didn't. Time moved forward. Normally. Slowly. Relentlessly. The ship, Reverse, was outside the orbit. But the price of escape was higher than they had expected. Out of 5 people, only 3 remained. And each of them understood, even if they made it home, they would never be the same as when they left. Because a part of their future had remained there forever. After leaving the orbit, space felt unnaturally quiet. There were no distortions, no strange delays, no sense that events were outrunning thoughts. Time was flowing evenly again, as it should. At least, that's what the instruments showed. The ship, Reverse, drifted for several minutes before the commander gave the order to check all systems. The responses came instantly, no anticipation, no repetition. Communication with Earth was restored. A familiar operator's face appeared on the screen. Reverse, confirm mission status. The commander answered almost automatically. His voice was calm, but inside there was only emptiness. He understood, the real trial was still ahead. Only a few hours had passed on Earth. For the crew, much more. When they transmitted the crew roster, there was a pause on the other end of the line. The operator asked again. Then once more. According to official records, the ship had launched with 4 crew members. There had never been a 5th. His name was missing from the documents. His photographs were not found in the database. His personal file had never been created. As if he had been erased not only from the present, but from the past as well. The ship was sent home. The return flight passed without incident, but the tension did not fade. Each of the remaining crew members felt that they had not come back whole. As if something essential had been left behind, beyond the orbit. At times, it felt as though they were waiting for something. Some event. Some future. But they could not remember what it was. After landing, they were immediately isolated. Medical examinations, psychological tests, interrogations. Everything followed protocol, but the doctors quickly noticed anomalies. All 3 suffered from memory gaps. Not related to trauma or stress. They were forgetting not the past, but what they were supposed to do next. One of them could not remember why he had gone into space at all. Another could not imagine his life a year from now. The third felt a constant sense of completion, as if his journey were already over. The mission reports were classified. Officially, it was announced that Reverse had completed a standard research flight with no significant discoveries. All materials related to the orbit were destroyed or placed under the highest level of secrecy. The orbit was removed from maps. Satellite routes were altered. Any mention of it was forbidden. The truth had proven too dangerous. But the orbit did not disappear. From time to time, automated stations detected strange signals in that sector. Weak, barely noticeable. They resembled telemetry from old spacecraft. The signals were coming from the future. One of the surviving astronauts once woke with the feeling that something had ended. He could not explain what exactly. He simply felt that his story had reached its conclusion. A few days later, he died in an accident. Without witnesses. Without warning. As if the orbit had taken what it had not managed to take right away. The second left the program and vanished from view. Officially, he changed his name and place of residence. Unofficially, he simply ceased to exist for the system. The third lived the longest. Sometimes he wrote notes. Short, fragmented ones. One phrase appeared in them again and again. "I came back, but not completely." The last recorded signal from the orbit was received many years later. It lasted only a few seconds. It contained data from a ship that had not yet been built, and the coordinates of the orbit, as if someone were preparing for the flight once again. The orbit where time runs backward does not destroy those who approach it. It simply takes what has not yet happened, and one day, it will take everything.